As the name Star Wars implies, there tends to be a lot of fighting within the galaxy far, far away. One of the main instruments of naval combat, in space or atmosphere, is the Starfighter. These are my top 10 Star Wars starfighters. Starting off at number 10 is an actually fairly large fighter that first saw battle in service of the Grand Army of the Republic. The Advanced Reconnaissance 170 Starfighter was equipped with a wide array of weaponry, including forward and backward-facing laser cannons as well as proton torpedoes, and was piloted by a crew of 3. It held a pilot, co-pilot, and rear gunner. S-foils on the wings would be opened during battle to expose heat sinks and radiator panels, keeping the ship's systems cool. It also had a built-in hyperdrive and shields, unlike some other fighters on this list. The ARC-170 remained in service after the fall of the Republic until the Empire phased them out for the newer TIE models. There have been many so-called Jedi starfighters over the years and throughout different media, but my favorite is the Eta II Actis Jedi Interceptor. It could be more colloquially referred to as simply the Actis, given that its full name was a bit of a mouthful. It was a lighter craft that only held a single pilot, which as the name implies was generally a Jedi. The pilot was assisted by an astromech fitted into a slot on the left wing. Since it was a lighter craft, it was not as heavily armed as some other fighters. It held only 2 forward-facing laser cannons and 2 ion cannons for disabling enemy ships. During combat, S-foils on either wing would open up to help with cooling internal systems. It lacked a hyperdrive and required the use of a hyperspace transport ring for deep space travel. Darth Vader continued to use a modified Black Actis for some time during the rise of the Empire until his iconic TIE Advanced was developed. At number 8 is the Alpha 3 Nimbus-class V-Wing Starfighter. This model, more colloquially referred to as just the V-Wing, was an interceptor in the Republic Navy. It was not a bomber, despite what the 2005 Battlefront 2 may have led many of us to believe when we were younger. It was armed similarly to the Actis, though it did not have ion cannons, and also similarly lacked a hyperdrive due to its size. The V-Wing had room for a single pilot who was required to wear a sealed flight suit equipped with life support systems given that the cockpit was not pressurized. This pilot was assisted by an astromech positioned directly behind the cockpit. Like many of the former Republic's vessels, the V-Wing continued to serve the new Empire for some time until new starfighter models were developed. Its twin ion engines actually served as inspiration for the Empire's most ubiquitous nuisances. Next, let's talk about the first actual bomber on our list. The BTL Y-Wing Starfighter, most often referred to as simply Y-Wing, was commissioned by the Galactic Republic. It held a pilot and a gunner, as well as an astromech slotted in behind the cockpit, and was intended to be armed to the teeth. It had a pair of heavy forward-facing laser cannons, a rotating turret for the gunner, and a pair of proton torpedo launchers as standard armament, but it could also fire other ordnance from the launchers and could carry external ordnance on its hull. The Y-Wing was intended to be a long-range bomber, and as such had a built-in hyperdrive. Unlike many of the Republic's other fighters, the Y-Wing did not continue to serve the Empire. It did, however, end up as a common staple of the Rebel fleet, and later even served the New Republic and Resistance. Perhaps one of the most iconic designs in Star Wars, the X-Wing was the backbone of the Rebel fleet. Later models also served the New Republic and Resistance. It featured S-foils similar to those on the ARC-170 it was descended from, with laser cannons mounted on each. These would similarly be opened during battle to assist with heat dissipation. It also held proton torpedoes. The X-Wing was crewed by a single pilot with an astromech slotted in right behind the cockpit. It had its own hyperdrive, allowing it to operate more independently for longer missions. Interestingly, the X-Wing design was originally going to be the main fighter in the Imperial Navy, but the Empire decided to go with the TIE Fighter design instead in a cost-cutting move. This allowed the Rebel Alliance to acquire them instead, giving them a huge advantage in dogfights. Moving into the top 5, let's take a look at a starfighter that is completely unmanned. The Variable Geometry Self-Propelled Battle Droid Mark I, better known as the Vulture Droid, was a droid starfighter that was used extensively by the Trade Federation and later the Confederacy of Independent Systems. While they were capable of pulling maneuvers that would absolutely crush any organic pilot, they did not have the ingenuity that comes with a living brain. The droid was quadrupedal with a large head atop its chassis. When in flight mode, the head settled into position where one might expect a cockpit to be, and its 4 legs became wings that contained all of its weapons: twin forward-facing laser cannons and energy torpedo launchers. Some Vulture droids also held missiles containing buzz droids that would completely rip enemy ships apart. These fighters attacked in swarms, relying on numbers to overwhelm the enemy. They were only ever deployed in close proximity to command vessels, and as such did not have a need for a hyperdrive. Most Vulture droids ceased operation with the shutdown order from Darth Vader, though a few could still be seen during the Empire's reign. Now at number 4 is the first vessel, at least on screen, that showed the superiority of organic ingenuity when faced with swarms of droids. The N-1 Starfighter was developed on Naboo for the Royal Naboo Security Forces. It was known to be in use since at least the High Republic era, and continued serving Naboo through the Clone Wars and beyond. It was a small fighter that held only a single pilot with an astromech positioned directly behind the cockpit. As far as armament, the N-1 had twin forward-facing laser cannons and proton torpedoes. Though it was primarily used for security purposes in the Naboo system, it also served on longer missions like escorting Naboo's senator. It was fitted with a hyperdrive for this purpose. After the fall of the Empire, a Mandalorian bounty hunter named Din Djarin came into possession of an N-1 fighter that he and engineer Peli Motto modified extensively. Number 3 is of course the droid Tri-Fighter, because it kinda just has to be. This starfighter, like the Vulture droid, was unmanned and possessed an advanced droid brain. It was very heavily armed despite being the smallest vessel in use during the Clone Wars, with a light laser cannon on each of its 3 arms, 1 heavy laser cannon on its nose, and 2 flex ordnance launchers. These could hold proton torpedoes, concussion missiles, or discord missiles containing buzz droids. Droid Tri-Fighters were designed for intense dogfighting and as such lacked a hyperdrive. They were an important part of the CIS fleet, especially in the later days of the Clone Wars. Their design was inspired by the Droideka, or Destroyer Droid, another feared droid model designed by the Colicoid Creation Nest. Like the Vulture droid, all Tri-Fighters were deactivated with Darth Vader's shutdown command, though a few could still be seen harassing the Empire years later. While most TIE fighters were functionally cannon fodder, the TIE Defender was conceived as a response to the growing threat of rebellion from the Empire subjugated. This pet project of Grand Admiral Thrawn was developed in secret as an alternative to Project Stardust, and many high-ranking officers began to support diverting funding from that project due to its delays and astronomical expense. The TIE Defender continued to use the twin-ion engines and ball-shaped cockpit that the Imperial fighters were named for, but that is about where the similarities end. Physically, this prototype fighter had 3 wings instead of 2, and it also came equipped with a hyperdrive and shielding. Designer Morgan Elsbeth also armed it to the teeth with twin laser cannons mounted on each wing, 2 more chin-mounted laser cannons on the cockpit, 2 ion cannons, and 2 warhead launchers. These could be loaded with concussion missiles, proton torpedoes, or ion torpedoes. It could even support a tractor beam projector if needed. This monster of a starfighter was easily the most advanced in the Imperial fleet and could have spelled disaster for the rebellion if production wasn't halted by the destruction of Lethal's fuel depot.
Was this part of the demonstration?
Finally, at number 1 is the ASF-01 B-Wing Assault Starfighter. I would really love to have a word with whoever names these things. Anyway, the B-Wing, as it was more commonly referred to, was an absolute juggernaut for its size. Not this thing. Personally, I think this thing looks absolutely ridiculous, but this is a perfect example of form over function. It was a long, vaguely dagger-shaped vessel with 2 S-foils situated just slightly off-center closer to the cockpit. Speaking of the cockpit, it featured gyroscopic stabilization and would rotate independently of the ship to minimize G-stresses on the pilot. Weapons were located on either end of the ship and on each of the S-foils, and were both numerous and extremely powerful. Armament packages varied somewhat depending on the model of B-Wing, but they always had at least 4 high-powered cannons, as well as proton torpedoes and laser-guided bombs. The prototype model flown by Harrison Dula also featured a composite beam laser that could combine the power of each individual cannon and pack enough of a punch to level an entire mountain. These fighters held more firepower than most smaller capital ships and could even sync their targeting systems for coordinated attacks. Unfortunately, they weren't great in dogfights and were a pain to maintain, so they weren't super widely used. But you can bet the imps knew fear every time one of these blockade busters came out. Let me know if you have any differing opinions or if I missed any fearsome starfighters. Just don't start a fight in my comments. Please like the video if you enjoyed and join the family if you want to see more nerdy shit. Remember, love recklessly. Start with yourself.